Absolutely. Thank you, Craig. And as we've said, if you missed us already, saying it to you, good morning, wherever you are joining us from. It's important to us to acknowledge that SAIT is situated on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Today, for Craig and myself and the campus of SAIT, we are based in Calgary, which is also known as Mokinstis, which means elbow, and that's a place where the two rivers meet. The traditional land of the Blackfoot people, it's shared by the Beaver people of Tsuut'ina and the Nakota people of the Stoney Nation. It's a place where we all walk in the footprints of the Métis people. Wherever you're joining us from today, good morning. Thanks for being here.
Perfect. Thanks, Jenny. Good morning, folks. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Craig Hess. I'm the Director of Corporate Training here at SAIT. I work with a fantastic team who's responsible for working with organizations to help them upskill and reskill their employees using any of the great content and the fantastic facilitators like Jenny that we have here at SAIT. So as we go through this morning, we'll be chatting about psychological safety. As you know, we've got some general themes we wanted to touch on, but this is your opportunity to give us your feedback, ask us your questions. So you'll see me looking off to the side here, monitoring the Q&A in the chat. My email is closed, so I won't be checking that while we're going through here. But Jenny, why don't we? Excellent, yeah, great place to start. You know, I know we've certainly seen an increase in the requests that we're getting around this topic of psychological safety and how to effectively manage teams through all of this that we've gone through in the past year. You know, psychological safety is a popular term. Is it becoming cliche? Is it a term that's understood or often misunderstood? So I guess, is it on the rise? And if so, why is psychological safety on the rise, Jenny?
Oh, we started with a really good.
Yeah, let's keep it simple, all right? Let's just,
welcome to Friday, Jenny. No, you're absolutely right. Actually, we spent a lot of time talking about psychological safety. Is it the kale of the day? Yes and no. And I think it's the misunderstanding of the concept that leads it to sort of people seeing it as that kale. Like, is it a fix for everything? No, you can't hide a bad work design. If you've got a good work design, you're off to a head start. But psychological safety, you know, when it's misunderstood, it turns up as these sort of three expressions. So just trust me. Now, the weight behind that statement is absolutely huge. And trust, for those of you who've sort of looked at it at all, is based on much more than just that physical, do I trust you or do I don't trust you, a two-way piece. And psychological safety is when we do that amongst a team. So it's not just a one-on-one thing, it's really a team belief, a shared team practice. The other one where it shows up a little strangely is when people say, well, my door's open, of course you can come and talk to me. And even that virtual door, yeah, just send me a note or let's just set up a quick conversation, remembering everything we said last week. It's all very well if your door's open, but if your mind isn't open, then we've that lack of psychological safety too. But people feel that they're checking the box because they say, yes, you can come and talk to me about anything. And then the other piece, and I'm sure this is going to come up today a lot, failure. And, you know, when I talk to leaders and I say, you know, what's your relationship with failure? What happens within your team? Is it okay for people to fail? Yes. Okay. What happens when they do fail? Well, eventually it's a performance issue. Okay, and that's the point where I kind of swallow and take a deep breath. And then the other big question for leaders was, when was the last time you failed? And even more than that, when was the last time you spoke about it? And so what we can sort of see within this psychological safety area is here's a huge, huge concept. And it takes time and it's intentional. And there's so much to it that people want to just check a box and move on, say, yeah, we've done that. And you can't. Like, it just takes work.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to come back to that failure comment because that one's particularly interesting to me. But maybe if we could, why don't we just start by defining psychological safety so we have a good place to start from for everybody, right? There may be different views out there as to really what is it on your team. So any thoughts on that?
Oh, lots. So some people will have seen, actually you posted the video scribe that we'd created, and within there, two key sort of let's use the expression thought leaders in this area. Truly what that means is they have done a ton of research to find us some really valuable pieces, and they'll have their own set definitions. The one I've seen recently, in fact, I did stick it on a slide. Here's me trying to find the slides as we go, but I did stick it on a slide for people. Came from Dr. Timothy Clark, and he's the most recent one to release information on this. And I like this sentence because what he describes psychological safety as is that environment of rewarded vulnerability. And I like using that because the word vulnerability it makes people sort of sit there a little bit uncomfortable because we don't understand what vulnerability is. And truly what we're talking about here is it's as simple as me speaking up in a meeting and asking a question, me sharing an idea that's not fully fledged or fully formed, being able to challenge the status quo. That is the pinnacle of psychological safety. But you have to be extremely vulnerable to disagree with somebody who has been in leadership for years and almost, and I think this is a Clark term as well, fossilized in the status quo. We've always done it this way. So this is the way we should do it. So that to me is what psychological safety is in essence.
Yeah, interesting. I like that, fossilized. And
yeah,
I know we've got some SAIT colleagues on the line with us today, and I've only been at SAIT for 6 years. I spent 17 years in pharmaceutical industry before I came here, and I will say 104 years of inertia. It's an interesting thing to sometimes raise a question as to why are we doing this the way we do it. Early on, it was not something I was comfortable doing, I will say. Some on the team may now say I do it too much, but that's okay. That's who I am. I'm fine with that. And that is a great definition. I do, Emily, great point. So how do you create that then for your team? How do you we've all sat in meetings, I'm sure, where you feel like you want to say something, but you're sure everybody else is thinking it perhaps, right? So if I'm thinking it, somebody else is thinking it, so why should I say it? Right. Mm-hmm. So how do you help encourage that? What is something you can do in the moment if when you're working with your team, how do you help them bring that out?
So I think that comes to in this sentence, and I'll drop the slide in a minute, but it's important in there is that rewarded vulnerability. And so when we look at Amy Edmondson, who's one of the key leaders, if you're in here today and you haven't seen her TED talk on psychological safety, and we'll put it in the link when we send our after email, here's the recording. She talks about 3 things that help us to build psychological safety. The first one is set the terms of engagement. So in some cases, it's a good time to challenge the status quo. There are other times when it's not. What are those terms of engagement? What does that look like? The second piece is creating that space for voice. We talked about that a little bit last week is, when do I speak up? When do I get the time? We have a lot of meetings where leaders just come and do all the talking and we're done. There's no space to be able to question there. And then the third one, and this is the one that relates to what you were just saying, is that productive response. Because if my vulnerability is rewarded, if I ask a difficult question and you as my leader say to me, that's a really good question, never thought of it from that angle, thank you. Now you're going to get full me saying, well, here's why I think it, here's where I'm coming from. I could be wrong, but we've opened up the space for that conversation and we're seeing it from 2 different perspectives. If I ask my question and you go, we talked about this last week, Jenny. Now I'm not rewarded for that vulnerability and I'm going to shut up basically. And I'm not going to give you the best. I'll just comply. I'll do what you ask. And so now we'll still survive. Like we'll keep going. We're just going to be really, really average compared to what we could have been if we'd had the great conversation. Ties back a little bit to that quote that was on the bright blue slide earlier. People sort of mistake psychological safety as everybody's nice to each other. Absolutely not. It's about being able to disagree.
Right. So I was going to touch on something though, but what if we did talk about it last week, Jenny?
Okay.
In all seriousness, right? Because that can come up. So what if we did talk about it, right?
Yeah. So there's 2 pieces in there. And the first piece is, if you believe that we talked about it last week, and I'm still bringing it up this week, where did that disconnect happen? I may not have been heard and understood.
Sure.
You may feel that we've talked about it. I might not be done. And if we're in a meeting, okay, the meeting isn't the time for that. Jenny, I see that's still really important to you. Let's just touch base after the meeting.
Okay.
And then, what's the disconnect? Why aren't we picking that up? Sometimes there's secret agendas in there. And that's another piece that sort of really sits with the leaders, because you get what you tolerate. So if you let somebody play in that space, now I'm messing with you. I'm bringing it up again because I know that I'm going to press a button here. That's a really different one-on-one conversation between us later. There's something to unravel in there.
Fair enough. It's interesting too. And I think your earlier point, and often coming from a sales and marketing background, we talk about the recipient of a message needing to hear it 5, 6, 7 times sometimes to get it, right?
Yeah.
Yet I find that sometimes when we turn around and talk internally, we forget that forget that lesson, right? It becomes a one and done. We've talked about it. So interesting. Couple comments coming in here. I'm just taking a look at Brenda. Absolutely questioning the old guard takes courage. And definitely necessary to move forward at times. I think I would add the at times in that, because I think to your point earlier, Jenny, there may be times to do it and there might be times not to, and depend, obviously situational specific. CJ, being confident in your ability to challenge the status quo and ask the difficult question why, provides the transparency for confidence. Absolutely. The 5 whys of how do you get to the root of a problem can be an interesting one. I think, Jenny, for me, it's always fun to figure out how do you stop the sounding like the 3-year-old or the 2-year-old who always says, why?
Then there's a really interesting piece there too, because a couple of things. First off, challenging the status quo, it takes time. So if you're listening here and you're thinking, okay, I don't have much psychological safety on my team, it's unlikely in a week you're going to get to challenging the status quo, unless you're skilled in sort of prodding and encouraging that active dissent, which is possible. The other piece is that why. And here's the piece with challenging the status quo. If the phrase in your workplace, career limiting move or career suicide, is prevalent, you don't have psychological safety, because people are, they're not going to challenge the status quo. And one of the reasons that happens is that wonderful little thing called ego. And so, if I have a fantastic idea, I've been working on it and I love it, and it's harder the more I love it, and you say to me, that's not going to work. It is an awful lot of energy not to let that ego just come right out there. And that little word why makes it harder, because when we say why to somebody, why did you do it like that? Immediately, for most people, we're on the back foot a little bit. Now we're protecting ourselves, and we've just lost that genuine conversation. In essence, a what and a how question usually can get you to the same place with a little less defensiveness. And there's that productive response piece again.
Really good point. I like that. Question from Kathleen has come in here. What if you feel intimidated to speak in a group meeting among your peers? How do you get past thinking that what you have to say or ask will be brushed off or thought unimportant?
Yes. So we're always running a sort of a risk detection piece. And so, Kathleen, to lean in is really going to depend on site, situation, context. Generally, if self-confidence is low for a person, I'm going to say start somewhere really safe. Start somewhere where you're good. Ask those questions, get used to speaking out loud within there. So once you've moved along that line, it is a matter of risk detection, and you decide, you have to make that decision based on how you're seeing it. Maybe don't dive in at the deep end. Maybe start with a smaller one. Maybe it's a follow-up later. And Craig, I've done this with you. I've sat in a meeting paralyzed by the people who are in there thinking, this is not my place to say anything. And then have dropped you a line later and said, this is what I was thinking. And here's the productive response, because, and embarrass you, no word of a lie, those are really good questions, Jenny.
Yeah.
Here's what I think. Okay, so just that one little piece where you said those are really good questions allows me to think next time, okay, this is a good question. And I have a value. And the other piece that's really important that I think helps that confidence, I see it differently than everybody else sat around the table. And that's true for everybody else sat around the table. So that's another piece for leaders, is no one will have the same perspective as you. And in fact, you really don't want them to have the same perspective as you, because that's useless. That's the same as your perspective. What we want to have is the different perspectives around the table, because that allows us to learn and grow in the space as well. So Kathleen, that was a really long answer for a short piece. Know that you have value and impact. Know that you have a different perspective. And then there's that kind of that deep breath, try it.
Yeah, and something else I've seen be effective is when you're in that moment, being willing to kind of be vulnerable and say, listen, I'm not comfortable making comments like this or posing questions like this, but this is the way I see it.
Yeah.
That phrase, this is the way I see it, can help put it takes a lot of that tension out of that moment of trying to just coming across as the expert, I guess. And so, I think that I've used that phrase before. It's an interesting one. I think it can help, couch things a certain way. And I think it ties in a little bit with Lisa's comment here as well, is that, people create stories in their head themselves. And how do you overcome those stories? You've had it happen to you once. So now that, to your point, Jenny, it wears on you and it beats you down a bit. So Kathleen, if we've answered your question, just please give us a yes or no in the chat. That would be great. Another question here from Santana. What can managers do to empower their team or provide the tools for those team members to feel comfortable engaging in, I love this phrase, productive disruption?
Yes. So like everything with psychological safety, it's a timepiece. It's really a culture that we're building. And it's everything that we've said already is going to play a part in there. So Lisa's comment on people telling themselves stories, we have to help with that piece. That the statement you just used, this is the way that I'm seeing it, brilliant. From the leader's perspective, here's the story I'm telling myself. I'd love to hear what it looks like from your side. And then that opens up and allows from it. There's another piece, in your meetings, maybe when you start your team meeting or with your team, is to say, I have a perspective, but the value in this meeting comes from me hearing your perspectives. And then don't fill in for them. Give the space and allow them to talk. Corporate Rebels had a brilliant term. If you're the leader in the group, you're the hippo. And the hippo is the highest individually paid person's opinion. It's an acronym there. Well, it's so true. And if you give your perspective to start with, you kind of kill the conversation, because everybody's going to lean towards you because you're that hippo. And so if you open up and let them, then they can join that conversation more. If it's new, it's going to need to be gradual. Start easy, start small, make it one piece per meeting. We call it creating space for voice. And maybe the first thing is, what do we need to have on our agenda? What are the things that we're not talking about? What as a leader am I not seeing that you would like me to see? But the key in all of this is, once you make that offering, is then to listen and really listen.
Yeah.
And you can put any term on that you want, sort of active, generous, whatever those pieces are. But to listen requires energy, and it's a different level to allow this psychological safety.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was listening, and I noticed that you said that something I said was brilliant. So I'm going to take that away into my weekend. So I really like that. But anyway, so I want to come back to this concept. You mentioned it earlier of being nice, right? Psychological safety, these rainbows and butterflies. I'm reminded of a kid, or a book I used to read the kids when they were younger. I can't remember. It was, I can't remember the author, but it was, in kindergarten, we share everything.
Robert Munch.
Thank you. That was it, Robert Munch. And so can we talk about that for a second? You know, this whole thing around, is psychological safety all about this nice, which you said earlier it's not. You know, how does conflict play into psychologically safe workplace, and you know, thoughts around that?
Mm-hmm. And I'll find it. I have a slide, needless to say. So what the mistake that people make is that this is all soft skills, and it's soft and fluffy, and it's just lovely. And it is, the results are lovely. But if we have a psychologically safe workspace, it actually means that we're going to disagree. And again, Tim Clark talks about, you're in charge as a leader, you're in charge of the friction equation. And so the aim is to have intellectual friction high, social friction low. Okay. So that means that we can have complete candor with each other, but it doesn't affect that social piece. So we can disagree vehemently within the terms of engagement that we have set. And terms of engagement are as simple as, it is perfectly all right to disagree with me. It is not all right to raise your voice. Or in our meeting room, the expectation is that we will see things differently. The expectation is that we will not be aggressive with each other. What does aggressive look like? And these are conversations that get forgotten because we just presume that everybody knows it's not appropriate to shout at your colleague. And silently across wherever everybody's joining us from today, we're all sitting there saying, seen it. It does happen. Of course, it happens with people. And so set those terms of engagement, and then you can allow that intellectual friction to drive up. It won't happen if you haven't built your social capital. And social capital is that knowing each other, and knowing each other beyond Craig does this, Jenny does that. Right.
Yeah, for me, it also kind of ties back to the concept of failure that I wanted to.
Oh yeah,
you brought it up earlier, and especially maybe for new leaders or experienced leaders taking on a new team. This whole concept of, how do you, as a leader, be willing to fail, or sometimes doing what I admittedly will default to, or at least my wife reminds me that I do, is, you know, go into solve mode. Even if I don't know the answer, right? So, you know, how do you open up that space as a leader to show your team that, you know, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
And those can be frightening moments as a leader, if you get hit with a scenario or a situation, or business isn't going well, or whatever it is, and you're just perhaps at a loss as to how to progress.
Absolutely. And there's that vulnerability. There's that confidence again. There's that courage again. So all of that's going to play in there. I think the piece to remember, if you look at, we have 4 levels of psychological safety. So the first level is what we call inclusion safety. And it correlates. Everybody who's working on their EDI, it absolutely correlates with those conversations. Inclusion, if we don't have that piece, we're not going to be able to achieve the rest. And inclusion is as simple as, Craig, you belong on this team. You have value on this team. Your perspective is important. We're incredibly good at not including people, just quite naturally, which is interesting, because what we know is, as humans, we need connection. We strive to be accepted before even we're heard and understood. So that's the first piece. So if you're a new leader, the first thing to build is your social capital. Build the inclusion, build that team. Then comes what we call learner safety. And this is where the failure piece becomes okay. And some of you, there's lots of you in here who've heard me say this before, and it's not mine. Unfortunately, I don't remember whose it is, but FAIL is an acronym for first attempt in learning. And so when we shift that mindset to, oh, you failed, that's interesting. What happened? What can we learn? Where can we go to next? Then you change the conversation, and then you change what happens next. And you also just made it safe for somebody to say, again, this didn't go well. There's a couple of riders in here. Number one, if you're starting off, don't start with the potential to ruin the company, harm people. That's not a part of this. That's a completely different failure conversation. And the other piece is, are all failures good failures? No. And, you know, if I report to you and I've made a mistake and we've had a conversation about it and theoretically I've learned, and then I make exactly the same mistake again and again, okay, now we're having a different conversation. But there's an awful lot of places where it's, you know, it's quite trendy at the moment. Experiment, fail fast, fail well. What does all that mean? What that means is I'm telling you and I'm not getting reprimanded for it. And the reason that it's tough for a lot of people, think about where we've come from, that control and command mindset, that crazy notion out there that if you set your goals and you achieve them, I'll give you a bonus. Well, I can't fail because then you won't give me my bonus. Exactly. And so we have to set ourselves up for success in this space to understand it properly.
Yeah, interesting. That fail, you know, how do you really help people recognize it is okay to take a risk and do it? And I think that's where you have to have that culture and that organization that says it's going to happen, but how are we going to learn from it is the key thing. And I think that is often the step that organizations that embrace this fail fast, fail quick, move on, is they don't take the time to then pause and say, okay, here's what we did learn. Right. We failed fast. Great. We're moving on. You know, and, you know, to go back that phrase about, you know, you belong on this team. That's brilliant. Fortunately, you know, if I go back to my example with my wife, she has not yet come to me and said, you don't belong on this team. So I must be doing something okay. Question from Ina that has come in here is, what are some practical steps, let's try that again, some facilitation techniques a team leader can take in an ordinary meeting, right, in order to foster psychological safety? So I think maybe this is kind of that, okay, we've walked away, we've got our team meeting coming up on Monday type of idea. What can I do day one to start building this, if this is something that you want to focus on?
Absolutely. So let's use those three platforms, I suppose they could be called. One, have your terms of engagement set. So those could be described as team norms. Those could be your ground rules, like however you want to put them. As a leader, you have very little say. Let your team create what those norms are. Within that, I think Amy Edmondson actually calls it setting the stage. Set the stage. Okay, it is your expectation that people will disagree. So when you want to disagree with somebody, what does that look like? Talk about those behaviors. Okay, so somebody says, well, that if I disagree with you, then I'm scared that I'm going to hurt your feelings. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, as far as I know, in most workplace meetings, we're actually talking about a task, as opposed to me personally.
Yeah.
So when we're going to disagree, let's talk about the task, not the person. So if we lead with you did, now I'm talking about the person, because there's that you, that pointed finger. When I talk about the actual task, what I see here is, now we're talking about something slightly different. So set the stage, first off. Secondly, create that space for voice, invite participation. Depending on your team and the size of your team, you could ask the question ahead of the meeting. Here's a key question. Have a think about this. Brené Brown has a really good piece in meetings. She calls it turn and learn. So it was originally set up face-to-face. You can do it virtually, but have everybody start with writing their thought on a piece of paper. And then after 3, everybody turns them over at the same time. And so that then we avoid the group thing. We avoid the dominant voices. That's another thing as a leader you could do. Don't ask the dominant voice first. Their voice is important. Grab somebody else's before theirs. And then that productive response is really important too. So as a leader, you absolutely model what happens next for people. And so being on your game in terms of how to be productive within that space, it ties back to something, Craig, you were just talking about with the failure piece as well. As a leader, our job is to provide support. I need to know that you've got my back, because if I don't think that you have, I'm not diving in 100%.
No, exactly. Right. I've always thought my job as a leader, frankly, is to get crap out of the way so my teams can do their job.
Yeah.
That's simple. Right. So So Ina, if we hit the mark for you there, maybe just drop us a note in the chat if that's good. We'll take another question here from Melissa. How can we support our leaders within a company or department in creating more psychologically safe teams? How can we start to teach or help them enhance this skill?
The short answer is show up. Show up in full. When we look at it, there's lots and lots of reasons that people stay silent. There's lots of reasons that people don't answer. Helping a leader, that's a really good question. And I think it is to, if you're confident enough, it is to engage with that leader, and it is to provide your perspective safely. And by safely, I mean, I'm not talking about leaving here, going in or Zoom calling or Teams, whatever's working, and say, I need to talk to you and this is why. But it's introducing the topics. And there's so much out there at the moment that we can easily sort of, it's called nudging. And one of the simple ones might be requesting that on the agenda is the question, what did we learn this week? So if you meet on a Friday or you meet on a Monday, it would be last week, what have we learned? And just bringing that into the conversation, opening it up, can help a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. Melissa did pop a note in here. She recognized it was a packed question.
It is. I would love to unpack it. We need much of it today.
Well, it's the point around, there's creating psychological safety for your team if you're a leader of teams, but then there's also, if you're a leader of leaders, how do you bring that layer in as well? Because there are some things that only leaders of teams experience, and so how do you help facilitate that within that group of leadership, right? And if you have a leader who is struggling with a team, or perhaps you think is struggling in this area, how do you engage in that conversation? And how it can be a tenuous one to open.
Yeah, I think I think there's a couple of really cool pieces in here. So if you're a leader of leaders, you get to spread that culture fix a little bit further. So that's an opportunity. And then within there, sometimes it's a collective agreement, right? Our aim for the next week is to stop shaming, blaming, and judging. Let's give that a go. And we'll come back and we'll talk about what that looks like. Where do you catch yourself in that shame and blame game? And some people have nailed this. They've left it long behind. Others not so much. Can we challenge ourselves for a week not to judge? That is crazy hard. Like, even I've worked in this field for over 10 years. That is crazy hard. We're kind of wired to do that piece. Yep. And so you get, again, we're starting with the small conversations. But the other thing is to put things into place that help change the conversation. And so one of the popular sort of pieces out there is an AAR, an after action review. And so there, 3 simple questions. What did we set out to do? Or what did we set out to achieve? What did we actually achieve? And what happened in the middle? What do we need to look at between those 2 pieces? And you can run an AAR on anything.
Yeah.
And then the other piece that's followed pretty quick on the heels of that is, that's great afterwards, but you could also have, now what do they call it? A pre-mortem conversation. And a pre-mortem conversation says, what could possibly go wrong? And now you've opened up that piece, and we're dealing with it ahead of time. So when it does go wrong, we said this would happen, but we've already talked about how we're going to work within that frame if it does happen. So there's those kind of little pieces within there that encouraging, someone called it, I think, productive dissent earlier, or active dissent. That's huge. And there's numerous little sort of tricks and tips that you can use to bring that in. I think it's David Marquet uses a set of playing cards. And so around the table, 10 people, team meeting, and one of the playing cards is different from the others. Well, when you get that card, it is your job to actively dissent. And so for people who struggle, you've got a little bit of that, well, the card's making me do this, and here's what I'm seeing if I'm seeing it from that perspective. But we just just gave permission. And a lot of psychological safety is about permission and respect.
Yeah, interesting. So in the last 10 minutes, and just noticing in the chat, there's been a couple, I'm going to say perhaps tools or frameworks that have been suggested here. You know, Ina's raised the idea of using liberating structures. That's a new concept to me, so I think that's great. Miranda has posted some comments around Brené Brown and a great leadership manifesto. You know, I think, and then sorry, Eric, I just caught this. Can you repeat those? 1, what did we set out to achieve? 2, what actually happened? And 3 was this would be for the
what happened in the middle.
There you go.
3. Yeah, okay. What caused the difference? We wanted this, we got this. What caused the difference between the two? Perfect. And just why I'm stealing airtime. Liberating structures are fantastic. I use them all the time in the classroom and virtually. They have their own website, but there are some great ways to create space for voice. Perfect. And if anybody needs which ones work, you know where to find me. Perfect.
I just jotted it down. We'll mention it in the follow-up that we send out. So, you know, one of the things that we wanted to do on these Friday mornings, Jenny, was have a great conversation. I think we've done that so far, and I really appreciate all the questions and comments that have come in. We wanted to provide folks with one big idea and perhaps a couple of things to take away. And so I do know we have slides on those.
See if we can make this work. This should take us there. There we go. There's the one big idea.
There's the one big idea. And folks, you will get a copy of the slides following this as well. So don't worry about that. And yeah, so Jenny, maybe let's just touch on this if you like.
Yeah, I have to come clean. It was really hard to have one big idea. This is such a big conversation. We could spend days in here. So I think this one works well in that psychological safety, if you can build it, and that's an important piece, it's intentional, it's a continuous practice, it is not a checklist item. So it's got to be a part of your culture. But once you neutralize a lot of the things that cause the team to be very average. So that inclusion piece, Craig, you mentioned that culture of belonging. A team that has that, really different than an average team, because you've got that culture of helpfulness, that reciprocity, the trust, I'm here to support you. The sort of echelon of that is, my job is to make you look brilliant. That's really difficult to do in some environments. When we know this, when psychological safety is high, engagement and satisfaction go up and people stay because they like working there. It feels good to work there. They get to give the best of them. And that's rewarding in our workplace. We haven't actually talked about this much, but it is psychological safety that will lead to creativity and innovation, because in order to innovate, we have to have that intellectual friction, because the best ideas come from many different perspectives and many, many disagreements. And then the culture piece too, it just gives a culture that people connect to, that we want to be a part of.
Like that concept of friction for me, I always think of just the term debate. Can you have a healthy debate, right?
Yeah, that's a great starting place. Yeah.
Apparently, there's nothing wrong with the concept of debating, right? It takes a lot out of it. Sorry. Anyway, I know you got a couple strategies that we can.
It's a good piece. Yeah, we've spoken about these a lot actually already, so I'll do them so people can see them. The first one is that inclusion safety. That's the first level. And I know that Craig was going to drop, or Craig, you were going to drop the link to the video scribe in the chat. I'm not sure if we got there yet.
You're right. That's a great reminder. I'm glad we have this psychological safety where you can prod me, Jenny. There we go.
It's just, it's 5 minutes, but it talks in there about these 4 different levels. And that first one, inclusion safety, relies heavily on social capital. And social capital does take time. I said this last week, I'm a big fan of do it every meeting and then in between as well. But everybody has their own way that they like to build that piece. But really, how are you connected? What are you doing to allow people to tell their stories? We're going to talk next week about returning to the office. Everybody has a different story about COVID. This is a huge social capital opportunity in building and connecting, and that builds the culture as well. That last one on the right-hand side, as you look at it, remember your job is make other people look brilliant. Goes a long, long way. It's really difficult, but it goes a long way.
Yeah.
And then our other one was that relationship with failure. So a couple of pieces for dealing with failure. There's the acronym first attempts in learning. And then actually, we didn't talk about this, embracing, I call it feed forward. What will help us as we move forward? And that allows us to promote what happens next, how we'll deal with that fail piece. As a leader, you got to do it too. So if it doesn't work, own it, talk about it, allow people to grow in that space. And then the last bit that we have talked about, pre-mortems and mid-mortems.
Perfect. Great strategies, great tools. I think a couple things that we can touch on too, and the three questions that we can get folks to walk away with thinking about is, how do you build it, right? How do you build trust and psychological safety in your team? What are you doing now? What have you taken away that you think you could possibly work on? To Jenny's point, these things don't happen overnight, right? It's been a great conversation to start the thought process. I think, especially for me, I've walked away with a couple things to consider for me and my team, but it's not going to happen overnight. And so then how are you building inclusion on your team? And I like, again, this one, how do you create active dissent or this productive disruption or this space for debate? I think I kind of put them all in the same piece. So, if you walk away thinking about those three questions over your Friday night beverage, whether it's carbonated or not, there might be some things that you can start looking at Monday morning when you get back with your team. So, Jenny, thanks again for a great morning. We will be back next week, and we will be back the week after. We've started these Friday mornings through the month of June. Next week, we are talking about the return to the office. That's starting to become more prevalent. Some of you on the call may already be there. But I think the point as well is that we haven't left work. We've really just left an office. And so, the work hasn't stopped. And so how are we going to make this a great spot for everybody when we do get back to the office? So you'll get a link again. Don't forget to register. Thank you so much for making it out this morning. And Jenny, any final words from you?
No, it was a great conversation. Thank you. Thanks for the questions from everybody listening in too. They really make a difference. It's strange to be put on the spot so much, but it's a good challenge and a great conversation. And Craig, thanks for picking up on the important pieces. As it says on the slide, you know where to find us if there's more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you. Folks, you want to reach out and have a conversation about how we could help your team, don't hesitate. I'm happy to take the call or take the email. And have a great weekend. Enjoy this weekend's sunshine compared to last weekend. So take care, everybody.
All right, take care. See you.
Bye.